Good evening and welcome. My name is Jane Siegel. I'm Vice Chair of the Planning Commission this year. Tonight, we're really pleased to have the second seminar in a series of 2 so far, Urban Design Fundamentals and Best Practices. Planning commissioners have really been very interested in having this kind of presentation because I think it gives us a framework and an overview that we can share at SPRC with the community so that we kind of have some fundamentals we can base our comments and questions off of. So I'm not going to say anything more than that, just I'm delighted to see this happen soon in the year. The last one was December, and so I'm now going to turn the podium over to Mr. Duffy.
Well, thank you, Vice Chair Siegel, and welcome to everyone who's here for this second in a series of urban design programs. And as you know, recently we had the first part of the Urban Design Fundamentals and Best Practices, and this will tie it all together this evening. I think everyone knows we're very fortunate in Arlington County to have a nationally and internationally recognized history and commitment to sound urban planning. One of the fundamental areas or aspects of Arlington's commitment is really about how we make great places and the role that urban design plays in shaping those places. And we do that through many different ways. The Planning Commission plays a central role along with our county board as we review various plans and various applications for growth and development. But we all do it as citizens as well. We're all part of this community in Arlington, and it's important from now periodically that we have a conversation really about issues and opportunities, particularly on the urban design front. And so we're fortunate in Arlington County to have really an outstanding professional team that I get to work with every day. And the planners and urban design professionals, architects, landscape architects that Chris Kreider, who leads our Urban Design Center, will introduce tonight, make a difference. And so we'll have a chance to hear more about what their commitment and what their current activities are. But also, as you can see, we'll talk about what our respective roles are in shaping sound urban planning and design. I think tonight will be really informal. We'll have a community conversation in some ways. I think you'll find the work that staff's prepared will be both inspirational and will again build our understanding and the importance of the partnership that both staff, the Planning Commission, other boards and commissions, and citizen planners in the county play to make great places and continue to make Arlington one of the region and one of the country's most dynamic places to live, work, and certainly visit. So I'm very pleased to introduce Chris Kreider, who leads our Urban Design Center. So Chris.
Thank you. Good evening, and we really do appreciate everyone for coming. I think, just to pose this question, you know, we all have opinions about what good design should and should not be. The question we need to ask ourselves is how can we move beyond expressing what we like or don't like about a project and start to describe why. What is the recipe for a successful dialogue about design? So to assist our understanding the foundational elements and utilized in the review of projects, tonight staff from the Planning Division will lead us through this informal discussion session. As mentioned before, this is the second session, and it's a two-parter. Part one is dedicating to highlighting the principles. What are the fundamental things that we learn in architecture school, landscape architecture, and so forth that really become the backbone of our mission? And then part two is an overview of how we apply these fundamentals to projects in Arlington. And you'll start to see the connection between these issues that we'll talk about. This will be followed by a discussion that will hopefully be a lively and engaging discussion where you'll have an opportunity to ask our experts here and to get to share your thoughts about design. Tonight's discussion is being taped and will soon be available on our Planning Division website, which will also continue to serve as a resource. There are a lot of great presentations there, a lot of good reference materials, best practices, county policies, and then this will also be a video archive for future discussions. Let me just take a second to talk about the Urban Design and Research section. We were formed 3.5 years ago, and it was really for the purpose to educate and engage the community on design, serve as a resource for the development review staff, consultants, developers, county leadership, and provide the technical expertise to ensure the highest quality development is achieved in our evolving urban environment. The urban design section also serves as a technical design and data center. We have an excellent research staff that helps us with development tracking and demographic data. And we also do things like this, engaging the public, talking about design, trying to keep the bar high and help us understand what the best strategies are for moving forward. So could we go to the agenda real quick? So as I described, there's 2 parts. We'll take approximately an hour to get through those first 2 parts, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Next slide. So the goals tonight, this is what we hope to achieve. We want to have a community conversation about design, and we want to provide you the orientation to what are the building blocks of good urbanism. Describe the art of creating a sense of place. We hear that term a lot, but what does it take to create those great places? Understanding the basic fundamentals, appreciating the variety of open space experience, active and passive spaces, and how the materials and the hardscape and the softscape really contributes to that. You'll learn about the terminology, county policies, and importance of solidifying the partnership between county staff and you, the citizen leaders. Hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding of the fundamentals of design and how it serves to create great places. So tonight we encourage the planning commissioners and other community leaders to share their thoughts and ask questions about architecture, urban design, and landscape. We also have a survey that we would like you to complete. Hopefully you picked it up when you came in, and that'll help us refine our presentations, and also we'd like to hear your ideas about future topics. So we hope, in conclusion, we hope you come away with a better understanding of the fundamentals of design, how it serves to create great places and spaces, and make us proud to be part of an ongoing transformation of Arlington County as one of this nation's most desirable smart growth communities to invest, work, and live in. I will now turn it over to our presenters, Justin Falango, our Chief County Architect, Brett Wallace, Landscape Architect and Principal Planner in the Urban Design and Research section, and Samia Bird, our Site Plan Coordinator in the Current Planning section. Samia is a strong voice. Her role is to prepare the excellent staff of the Current Planning section to manage the individual projects that come before us and realize the aspirations of our visions from our plans and bring that to reality. So without Samia, many of our aspirations we hold near and dear would never come to fruition. So we'll start with Justin. Thank you.
So I think if we're going to have a discussion about urban design, we need to have a common understanding first of what is meant by the word urban. And I think, so this picture here from New York City, I think this is something that comes to mind when people mention the word urban. They think of this great conglomeration of development, a lot of people, a lot of traffic, a lot of noise, a lot of density. And that is indeed an urban place, but some place like this is also very urban. So, this is a place where there's an assembly of homes. They're arranged in a very intentional manner together. They relate to one another. There's a few spots there. There's a little chapel right there. There's a little cemetery right there. And so they're arranged around these sort of common spaces. And so even these, just this little hamlet way off in the countryside can be also very urban. And even indeed a single house, I think, can be very urban. So Mount Vernon, just the way that it's, the road comes up and meets the house, it creates a space in the front. The dependencies of the main house sort of are arranged in a manner that's actually incredibly urban and very intentional. And I think it's important to think about what isn't urban. So density alone does not make things urban, or just things being close together aren't necessarily urban. Buildings like this, while they may serve functions in integral parts of our community, are not. They're in a way very antisocial. The homes on the bottom picture, the only thing you really see are the garages. There's no real doors or windows. There's no spaces that are framed by that. And the commercial building is set very far back from the street. So there's no, the implications for socialization and pedestrians and things are not really considered. Now, what's urban design? So urban design is a multidisciplinary field. It involves quite a few things. It involves transportation and land use and buildings and open spaces and landscape, hydrological, environmental factors, and the placement, I think first and foremost, the placement of buildings in a very intentional manner. And then there's also economic and social and cultural implications that go along with that as well. Neighborhoods are something that are sort of the basic building blocks of all great cities and towns. And they're something that they really haven't fundamentally changed very much in hundreds or even thousands of years. The diagram on the left is from the architectural graphic standards that every architect has on their desk. It's a diagram from 1929 by Clarence Perry, and it sort of outlines what the basic building blocks of a neighborhood are. That's actually since been updated. It's still in the graphic standards, and again, it hasn't really changed a whole lot. All great cities are made up of neighborhoods. Paris has famously has its neighborhoods, and Arlington also has its neighborhoods, which those neighborhoods are reflected in our land use policies and in our general land use plan. And there's certain fundamental things that neighborhoods have. Neighborhoods have an identifiable center and edge. Often the edge is some kind of larger arterial or some kind of natural feature. They have a range of housing types. There's places to eat and work, and open spaces and places to recreate. And so ideally, every neighborhood sort of has a little bit of everything, and sometimes the neighborhood is a little bit more residential, and sometimes the neighborhood might be a little more commercial, but generally, a neighborhood has a range of things in it. And cities are also made up of sort of the building blocks of buildings, but they're not necessarily all on equal footing. So you can have a building that's made up of all civic buildings, but you need the combination of the civic buildings and the public or the private buildings together that in concert sort of make up a city. Washington, D.C. is a really good example of that. So this, from the McMillan plan, you can see that the buildings that are sort of shaded in black there are the civic buildings. Those are the important buildings. And then the buildings that are in those blocks that are shaded more in pink, those are all that's the private development. So that's where people are living and working. And then together they sort of make up a city. And the same from the 1909 Burnham Plan for Chicago, very clearly outlines that. You can see the blocks of private development, and then there's special attention and special placement of buildings that have civic and cultural importance. So really, I talked a little bit about the enclosure and the intentional making of space, and I think this is really the most fundamental aspect of urban design. So it's really the buildings are important, but the most important thing really is the space between the buildings, making a place that's sort of comfortable and that's really very clearly defined. And so those, it can range from, you see the upper left-hand corner, that's actually a very narrow street from Europe, to maybe the one up on the upper right is more of a typical American main street. But the thing that those very successful places all have in common is they generally have pretty tight proportions that the buildings and sometimes often the trees make to create that space. 1 to 2 or 1 to 1 is often a very good proportion. And if you get any farther apart from that, then you start to lose that sense of enclosure and that sense of space. The design of the buildings themselves, while there are important factors that go into, kind of helping them reinforce those successful spaces, pedestrians are very comfortable in these more enclosed spaces, but the design of the buildings themselves doesn't matter as much. You can have something that's more traditional, you can have something that's more modern, but as long as you've got that enclosure and the buildings are all doing the right things, you're going to have a pretty successful environment where people want to be. Another aspect of that is sort of the idea of having a terminated vista, or to help with enclosure, especially if you have like a long street. You can do that. This is an example from Charleston, South Carolina. You can do that very intentionally. In this case, a church has been placed that sort of actually interrupts the street. But it can also happen in a more subtle way. I mean, a street just curves ever so slightly, or there's a hill or some kind of natural feature that sort of helps to create that sense of enclosure. And again, there's certain things for commercial buildings, for example, that are very important. You need to have transparency. As people are walking by on the sidewalk, they need to be able to see what's going on inside the buildings, sort of a sense of activity. But also you need some kind of delineation between the pedestrian realm and the upper portions of the building. And there's a lot of other things that go along with that, signs and canopies and street furniture, and that all kind of help to contribute to that. And again, it doesn't matter so much if it's a modern building or a traditional building. As long as you have those fundamental building blocks right, then you're going to have a successful spot. And the same applies for residential buildings as well. So having frequent entrances out to the sidewalk, maybe pushing back slightly from the street to give you a little bit of sense of privacy. But one of the most fundamental, I think, important things to having successful frontages for buildings is that they need to be continuous. So the photograph in the upper left-hand corners from, it's Walnut Street in Philadelphia. You can see a pretty successful retail street. There's a large assortment of buildings. They have all different designs. But the thing that makes that all possible, you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little aerial image. The red outline sort of delineates where Walnut Street is. The thing that helps support that is the networks of alleys that actually run behind the streets that help to service those retail areas. So if you imagine the same street interrupted by frequent loading docks and parking entrances and things like that, you start to kind of lose that synergy and that collective energy of all those shop fronts close together. So the design of these spaces isn't something that happens overnight, and it doesn't happen by accident either. This is an image from Savannah from the early 1700s. And you can see that if you've ever been to Savannah, one of the most famous things about it is the squares that it has. And they have a variety of characters to them. But you can see, so from, I believe this is 1734, so right as they're ripping the new settlement from the wilderness, you can see that even though at the time it's basically a single family home subdivision, but the homes are actually arranged in a way that's very urban. And you can see the squares are actually already there. They're already laid out and they're already sort of ready to be filled in and ready to be completed. And so over time, the city has just gotten better. There's this aerial photograph of Savannah. There's probably none of the buildings that were there back in 1734 that are still existing here, maybe one or two. But as each successive generation of buildings has come in, they've just helped to further reinforce those plans that were laid out hundreds of years ago. Rittenhouse Square from Philadelphia, the same idea, very old plan. It's been filled in over the years. You can see the buildings around it are from different time periods, they have different styles. But one thing that is very apparent is when buildings sort of aren't playing along with the others. All these are sort of helping to reinforce that space. And this one, the architect was just wanted to do his or her own thing. And so again, the idea that the buildings really all need to be working in concert to help to shape those spaces. And in addition to those buildings shaping the spaces, it's also important to think about the design of those, the open spaces that those buildings are framing. And Brett is going to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Justin. So Justin's done a really great job of setting up the framework you can see here in this map, excuse me, of Paris. We talked about neighborhoods, we talked about blocks, we talked about streets, and we talked about the placement of buildings, creating enclosure, and now we're going to move on to talking about the design of the public spaces, the spaces between the buildings. And you can start to see in this map here, outlined in green, the network of these open spaces and how all this really starts to fit together to create a special place in a great city. Before we start getting into the design of the spaces, we always like to look at comparisons from other areas across the country or the world. This is just an example of some other public spaces with different acreage, and we start to identify what works and what doesn't, what fits in what space, and we'll get into that detail in a little bit in a minute. So again, starting with scale, we've got everything from an iconic Central Park in Manhattan at 843 acres all the way down to a small pocket park only a few blocks from Central Park in New York at 4,000 square feet. And what you start to see in both of these images is really how those buildings are framing the spaces on all sides, but also the complexity of the amenities that are within those spaces, the trees, the movable furniture, people, and really go a long way towards helping create a special place. And once we start diving down into a public space, we'd like to look at what the anatomy is to create that special place. And so this is a diagram and a picture from Jameson Square Park in Portland, Oregon. And what you start to see here is, again, some of those principles applied here. So we've got buildings framing the public space with windows facing onto the space, serving as visual surveillance, eyes on the space. We've got a balance of passive and active uses here. We've got hardscape on the left with a very active water feature. We've got a more passive green lawn, flexible lawn space on the right here, and there's a hierarchy of paths that move through the space. And so all this really works together to create a great space. And this park, also pictured here, this is the water feature that's in the middle, is approximately 1 acre in size. Another thing that we like to think about too as designers when looking at plans is how do we incorporate active design and recreation and healthy lifestyles into our public spaces. A lot of this involves a lot of heavy programming, but planning out spaces that are flexible that can accommodate these type of events is critical. And again, I couldn't have a presentation without having a picture of the High Line in New York. I know it's a wildly successful public space, but this is really about how in urban design we're really truly connecting communities. And of course, this example truly does repurpose existing infrastructure. The old rail line, the High Line, of course, was repurposed to a linear park that connects multiple communities on the west side of Manhattan. And we have, in the future, our very own example here. This is, or we will have in the future, I'm sorry. This is the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. The Navy Yard is to the north here, and this is Anacostia over here. And so really, this is an existing bridge today that will be repurposed to create a really great public space, again, connecting those two neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. So again, thinking about repurposing infrastructure is something we need to consider when looking forward in our planning efforts. This is another example in Dallas, Texas. I'm going to flip back and forth between these just so you can see the comparison, but really this is the John Woodall Freeway in downtown Dallas. If you've been to Dallas, the Arts District is over here. And this was really a public-private partnership to deck over the freeway and create a really destination open space, and again, connecting communities on both sides. And you can see what a difference it makes. And this is a really good example, too, in terms of the design. You can see a hierarchy of paths. There's flexible lawn spaces. There's circulation. There's play spaces tucked in here, dog parks and other amenity spaces along this edge, active uses. And so that all really works together, and we'll talk about some of that detail on some further slides, but really a dramatic effect here. But also, in looking at our public spaces and looking at our public spaces, we have to really think about our public realm and our streets as public spaces. And so here you have an example of a parklet or a pop-up cafe that's in the public right-of-way, and then cafes and sidewalks, active sidewalks with off-board cafe seating and seating along the building frontage as well. And thinking about streets, we have to think about repurposing those as well. A lot of Our streets in the past were designed for heavy traffic and, emphasizing the pedestrian here. This is an example also in New York where too much excessive asphalt was converted into a public plaza, and they've done this all over the city. Other cities are doing this too, but it's really repurposing street space and turning it over to the pedestrian and giving pedestrian priority. And so when thinking about street space, we think about the public realm, and this is really a series of diagrams here, but I want you to focus here on the right first, is that we think about the ground plane, the sidewalk, the building wall and frontage, which Justin talked about briefly earlier, the canopy overhead, street trees, and then the roadside, whether that you have bike lanes or street parking and amenities that are along the curb in terms of loading and drops off. But we really like to look at this zone here. This is really about creating a pedestrian and a human scale. And good city planning and design is really about creating special places for people. So we have to understand how people move and, experience a city. So this is really a crucial area that we need to continue to look at when looking at future projects. And in terms of the streetscape design, we've identified, along with other cities, a building frontage, these zones for travel. There's a shy zone where cafe seating is usually located. There's a spill out zone for people coming out of retail and cafes. Usually there's a clear path outlined here in yellow, and then the furnishing zone along the curbside, where we see street lights, trash can, benches, and other furniture and utilities. And here you can see an example of that in City Center in DC, Washington, DC. So you can start to see the frontage type, a lot of transparency. We talked about the canopies, just visual interest along the building frontage, but you can start to see the shy zone, that clear zone, and the furnishing zone here on the right. And what I also want to point out about this picture, you start to think about different materials and how different paving helps to define those spaces as well. And in streetscape design, there's a lot of things we have to be considerate of, and we're learning lessons every day. But this example also at City Center has the tree pits set back about 18 inches to 2 feet from the face of curb, and you can see this woman here getting out of her car. That allows enough room for somebody to open their door and get out, and there's pavement here for somebody to walk along the edge versus falling in the tree pit. So again, design details like this is what we're looking at all the time when we're looking at streetscape. And in terms of streetscape furniture, depending on the district, we like to create a consistent, cohesive family of street furniture, again, so that everything relates to one another. It feels intentional and it's not piecemeal. And so this is just an example from the Roslyn Business Improvement District streetscape, some of the furnishings they're considering. And, all that, there's a lot of design thinking about how all that is laid out on the street. And so this diagram on the top really just shows the things that we need to be respectful of: the clear path for pedestrians, how benches are oriented, set back, again, to allow car doors to swing open, space on the sides for people to move around in terms of accessibility, and then the street trees. And in terms of the furniture, there's a variety of different furniture. I believe the success of a really, truly great public space has a variety of different seating options. So you have fixed seating, you have movable furniture, there's seating without backs, there's seating with backs, and then when you start thinking about seating, we have to think about the ergonomics of seating and user comfort, and thinking about the different angles of the back and what's a comfortable sitting height, which usually ranges between 16 inches and 20 inches. And so a lot of things to consider in the furniture layout and design. Also, we have street trees a lot on our streetscapes, and we all want healthy, large canopy trees, encourage walkability, they intercept stormwater, provide shade, but in order to get a large, healthy canopy tree, we have to think about what's happening below the pavement, so we have to think about soil volume, and this is just an example from Casey Trees out of Washington, D.C., where it shows the dimensions needed to provide for a healthy volume of soil to provide for a healthy tree. So again, these are things that are happening below the pavement that we're looking at throughout the design process. This is just another example of structural cells that support pavement. And this is an example of this going in the ground. These are plastic crates that support the pavement above, both pedestrian and vehicular loads, but also allow for uncompacted soil below grade so that the roots can spread out and eventually create healthy large trees. Streetscapes are also a way to intercept stormwater. We've got a lot of stormwater regs, and we're looking at how we can capture and treat stormwater runoff from the street and the sidewalk. This is an example from Washington, D.C. in the NOMA district, and looking at native plantings, low-impact development. We've got cafe seating, clear paths identified here, pervious paving, and other materials on the sustainable palette there for that project. Now, this is a diagram of Canal Park in D.C. It's over in the Navy Yard near the Nationals ballpark. It's comprised of 3 city blocks. It's not fully developed yet. This is a concept plan that shows future development on the east side. But this is really a truly, productive landscape. There's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of things happening below grade, where future buildings, as they come in, the rainwater is going to be harvested and reused to irrigate the landscape and flush toilets. During the wintertime, there's an ice skating ribbon here, and during the summertime, that's removed, and it's a water splash pad for children to play in. There's flexible lawn spaces. You can start to see here in this diagram, this aerial perspective, this is that splash pad. This is converted into an ice skating rink in the winter. There's a cafe here helping to activate this space here on the corner of M Street. And there's flexible lawn and event space that can be programmed to support some of those events that we were showing earlier. So again, a lot of things happening below grade, but also at grade, we start to think about materials and how everything starts to come together. And when we think about paving and design and texture, this is really a great example of how a paving pattern is a reflection of the pattern of the building. So the designers here, the building was there first. This plaza was renovated and really took inspiration from the geometric pattern on the building and really reflected that down into the plaza. And you can start to see that here in this close-up image on how that creates a dramatic effect, in an urban environment with people looking down on the space from their office building on the 20th floor, or people within the space. And even within the space, you can start to see how the planting and the design starts to create these outdoor rooms. There's movable furniture, and it really starts to create a sense of enclosure in this otherwise mostly hardscape plaza. This is another great example of a collision of a constructed environment with a natural one, and use of materials and landscape. The paving, it almost looks like the rock outcropping and the planting here was here first, and they paved up against it. But it's just another example of how we can look at our man-made, constructed environment and nature and express that in our designs. And a lot of times when we talk about open spaces, and here in Arlington we talk about active versus passive open spaces. And this is a good example. We have some other comparables in Arlington in the second part of this presentation. But this is an example in Battery Park City where we have a passive lawn space here, and then one passes through this rock outcropping and tunnel to a more active side of the park. So this is the passive side, flexible lawn spaces, lots of topography and landscaping, very lush. But then you pass through the other side, and it's a very active play space that's integrated within the landscape.
Why are we doing that here?
We're going to get going to that in a minute. And again, thinking about the different seasonal interest in the landscape, we've got a water feature here. How that's used in the summertime versus how it's perceived in the wintertime, it really creates a dramatic effect with the snow here, things that we need to consider in terms of seasonal interest in hardscape, but also in the landscape. We'd like to look at plants and species during our site plan review process, but even post-review, we're looking at landscape plans to ensure that we're selecting the right plant species that create the most dramatic effect. This is an example from the Lurie Garden in Chicago near Millennium Park, but this is a really great design, a way that the landscape architect used salvia, which blooms in the early summer. It creates a dramatic effect with a purple wave running through the landscape And so thinking about different seasons and plant species as we look at these landscape plans is what we do on a daily basis. And thinking more about the ground plane, looking at lighting in a different way. We have to think about these public spaces, how they're used at night. How do we animate the ground plane at night? And this is just another example of how you can achieve that. Another example of creative ground plane design here is at Dilworth Park in Philadelphia. This is City Hall. This was a renovated plaza. It was completed a couple years ago, but the SEPTA subway line runs below the plaza. It's mostly hardscape, but again, this one is programmed to be a water fountain during the summer, and I believe they do an ice skating rink here as well in the wintertime. This is a plan diagram of the plaza, and so the orange and the green represent the subway lines below the plaza, and so the designers work with an artist to create a lighting, interactive lighting display so that when the trains pass underneath the plaza, it's reflected in light in the plaza at night. And so just other creative ways to animate the ground plane and create interesting public spaces. And so with that, we're going to move into the second part of the presentation. This is an example here in Arlington of Pentagon Row.
1555 Wilson Boulevard.
We're going to save the discussion for the end of the...
How did we get 1555 Wilson Boulevard?
So with that, I'll turn it back over to Justin.
Make no small plans. I think we as Americans have actually done a pretty good job of making very bold plans for cities and towns. In particular, for the cities and towns that we may never actually live to see come to fruition, but really for future generations. And in Arlington, we're really good at making plans too. We have, all of our range of sector plans that we update quite often, and they all incorporate all these elements that Brett and I have talked about in terms of good urban design practices. They usually start with some kind of illustrative plan, a community vision about what we want to see happen over time. These plans envision new connections, new spaces that don't currently exist. And they also consider things like buildings and streetscapes and what the details of those should look like, how the buildings should relate to one another, creating open spaces, meaningful open spaces. But really, we can make lots of plans and we can have beautiful renderings, but the plans really can never come to full realization without the private development that sort of comes along and helps to fill that in. And Samia is going to talk a little bit about the importance of the private investment in our visions.
So I think one of the really significant things about development in Arlington County, as set forth with all the presentation we've heard so far, is that we really do set out and have from the very beginning in looking to develop our urban corridors, the Rosslyn-Ballston corridor, Jefferson-Davis corridor, and also now Columbia Pike, and establishing some sound plans that have been adopted that incorporate all of these design principles and really set forth and establish the vision that we intend to achieve in building out the county, in particular, again, those urban corridors. And so this diagram here, actually, it's a little difficult to see, but what it is our site plan layer, which all of the kind of coral or salmon shaded outlines that you see throughout the red area of the RB corridor, Rosslyn-Ballston corridor, really are where we have special exception site plan developments that have been approved. And typically what we look to do is developers are that's the primary way that we achieve the vision of a lot of our sector plans throughout the corridors is through these private development proposals that seek to develop on sites throughout the area. And really what we're looking for when we're reviewing those in our special exception process, which is a process that involves county staff as well as the community and others to look at fulfilling those plans and how they conform conform to them with the private development that they are putting forward. So there are a couple of phases of that. There's concept phase, there's preliminary phase, there's a final stage, and then once something is considered and reviewed and approved by the county board, there's a post-review process as well. And throughout these processes, staff, the community work with the developer to ensure that the plans are in compliance, what they're proposing, and also look at some of those details as we typically require that they submit architectural plans, engineering plans, landscape plans, and a lot of the things that were raised previously and that were outlined are discussion points with the community and also things that staff in their expertise, their professional expertise, look at evaluating. So we look at the streetscape, we look at the open spaces, we look at the building design, we look at how it meets the street and the public realm and how they are looking to implement the vision that we've set forth. And so that's the overall goal that we have, and we continue to do that to try to realize those plans that have been put into motion. And so with that, we want to look at some of the examples and some of the ways that throughout the process, we continue to work with the developer to kind of fine tune those details to make sure we're achieving the vision and the goals that we set forth and adhering to a lot of the principles that we've established that we want to see and how we want to see Arlington County develop out in these corridor areas. So with that, we're going to look at some details through some of the projects that we have worked with the developers on through our special exception process and how we continue to work to realize the goals. I actually kind of lowered it a little bit.
Okay. So I'm going to pause for a little trivia and see if I could get a show of hands of how many people know where this is in Arlington County. Oh, good. So this is the Metropolitan Park development over in Pentagon City. It was a phased development site plan project, and it's almost complete. And what you can see here is it really is holding true to all the principles that we just discussed in terms of the building placement and framing of the open space. It's really a great open space. It's not programmed. I'm not sure how well utilized it is, other than by the residents, but it's a successful example of how we've, can use all these urban design principles to really create a great place here, and it's coming to reality here in Pentagon City. And just to the north of that, this is the Penn Place PDSP project, which is unbuilt, currently vacant land, and this is just to the north of Met Park, and I wanted to walk through some of the diagrams and design and plan thinking that we went through in terms of the master planning and creation of that PDSP and design guidelines. But again, as you can see in these diagrams, we started with looking at blocks and streets. How can we break up that large tract of land and create a street network and developable footprints? We looked at open space in the public realm and how the Penn Place development is then connected with Met Park to the south. And we looked at building placement and the framing of open spaces, and again, reinforcing those connections, looking at 12th Street as a major transit and pedestrian corridor linking Crystal City to Pentagon City, and how all that comes together in this composite diagram to create a special place in Pentagon City. And so when we were looking at Penn Place and we were looking at the open spaces, for example, we always start to look at the context. What's around there? What are the amenities within those public spaces? We look at Long Bridge and Virginia Highlands and other Pentagon Row to the west and look at what amenities are in those public spaces and to help us inform what we might want to see in the future here at Penn Place. And for one open space, the 12th Street Plaza, so Met Park is to the south. This is really the first impression, if you will, to Penn Place. Really envisioned as an active retail, more of a hardscape plaza. But we started to look at other examples in Arlington County. So we look at Penrose Square, phase 1 that's complete, and the size, which is comparable to the 12th Street Plaza. And then we look at Pentagon Row and Welborn Square in Boston. We start to look at what kind of programming and what kind of amenities are in these spaces that, again, will help inform what we might envision in the future. And then within those spaces, once we determine the scale, we want to understand scale of those amenities that we might want to see here. So whether or not we want to see basketball courts or other large playing fields or other play features, again, we have to come back to scale and looking at comparisons and just understanding the size of certain things before we start on the drawing board. This is just a diagram, again, of Penn Place. So this is 12th Street here to the south. And a lot of the things that came up during the public discussion and community process was, how do we really get people into the interior of the park to the north? If all the activities here on 12th Street, what can we do to really activate this part of the open space? And so there's this strong axis that's really the organizing element of the park design. And you can start to see here in these diagrams, this would be 12th Street. This is that strong axis. There's a cafe that's really serves as a terminal vista, which Justin outlined earlier, but really a way to draw people into the site. And then how are things organized off of that central axis? So we've got flexible lawn space to support programming and events. There's planting design. There's children's play that's situated right next to the cafe, so you can get a drink, a cup of coffee, or what have you, and watch your child play. There's, again, the cafe as serving as that terminal vista. And then moving on to Ballston, this is a project example that was approved a few years ago. This is the Marymount University project, and this is really an example of a project where we worked very hard with not only the applicant, but the SPRC Planning Commission to take this design from what it looked like when we first got it, shown in this image here, to this image here, which is the final approved project by the county board. And again, focusing on the open spaces here, there were some slight modifications to the architecture, but I really wanted to focus on the open space and how we really got from this mostly barren hardscape plaza to a very active retail environment here with plantings and a lot of historical references, and which you can see here in this rendering, and I'll go into some of those details. But just an example of what we do as staff when we get a project like this, initial reactions. We meet with the applicant, we meet with the chair of the SPRC, we put together staff comments, and sometimes we put together diagrams like this about how do we respect circulation and respond to pedestrian flows through the project. How do we use landform and topography and landscaping to create a three-dimensional landscape and create some outdoor rooms and sense of enclosure? How do we use color, texture, and scale within the space to create visual interest through paving, lighting, landscaping, and furniture? And so we look at precedent images all the time. I shared these images earlier, but it's funny because we actually use these same images to inspire the applicant in the design process to look at how we can use landscapes to help to create spaces. We looked at how can we salvage and reuse some of the panels from the previous Blue Goose building that sat on the site, the Marymount University, and how can we reuse that, if not in the architecture, in the landscape. And so we work with the applicant and SPRC and HALRB and historic preservation staff to really get them to incorporate this blue element in the architecture, in the what will be the future Blue Goose Cafe, if I'm not mistaken, for Marymount, that fronts onto the plaza using blue architectural materials, and even into the landscape and the walls, again, creating a three-dimensional landscape. There's blue tiles, and then creating historical markers using the blue panels. And again, this is all organized in the plaza. And so this is just an example. On the left is the plaza, what it looked like when we initially received it. And again, you can see the excessive amount of hardscape. The second iteration, revised concept, a lot more green space, but as you could see in that previous diagram, not really respecting circulation through the space. And then this was the approved design that we ultimately, the county board approved. And it's under construction today. I believe it's almost complete, but it's coming to life. And again, just another example of an area without a plan and just using our own expertise in urban design to create a great place. And we're looking forward to seeing that be completed. Another example here is on Columbia Pike. This is the Village Center, the Food Star site, if you're not familiar. Penrose Square is to the east here, and this was the Columbia Pike illustrative plan, identified these spaces as town squares. And so as we know, Penrose Square is, phase one of it is complete. And so the Village Center site is here to the west on the corner of George Mason and Columbia Pike. And this is an image, a close-up image of the illustrative plan showing what that future Village Square should look like at the time when the plan was developed. And this is an image from the regulating plan in the Columbia Pike form-based code. This is the building, and the future square is colored here in green. So we're taking these plans to this level. So we went through an extensive public review process with the community, the advisory working group of the form-based code, and so this is Columbia Pike on the left, South George Mason Drive. This is really in contrast to Penrose Square. Penrose is very hardscape. There's a lot of paving. There's water features. This was really envisioned as more of a green oasis on Columbia Pike. So a lot of the green that you see here, rather than it being lawn space, it's really native plantings, like meadow-style planting, landscape design, more naturalistic, with some flexible spaces for gathering. There's main entrance at the corner. There's some topography issues here that were very challenging that we worked through to create an accessible entrance here at the corner. There's retail fronting it with cafes, seating. There's active edges and spaces to really get out and experience the landscape. And there's also some public art that's planned for this space as well. And here's just another diagram of the same space, showing the variety of different seating, like we talked about earlier, of fixed seating, cafe seating, movable seating, just to provide a variety of different seating opportunities for the square. Just going to wrap it up here, Justin. Thank you.
The Realize Roslyn plan envisioned a new 18th Street corridor running basically as the spine running through Roslyn, meant to be mostly a pedestrian street. And so one of the first projects, in addition to Central Place, one of the first projects that came in that was going to help to start to envision or actually realize that that vision for a new 18th Street corridor was 1401 Wilson Boulevard. And so when that came in for redevelopment, this was the initial proposal that was put forth. You can see that there's two towers here. The 18th Street corridor basically runs east-west, in this manner. And while the buildings actually, the separated buildings do sort of make that space and they do open up the view corridor, there was a lot of things that the initial proposal didn't do. It didn't do a particularly good job of allowing pedestrians to actually sort of circulate down through the site. There was sort of this convoluted network that you sort of had to navigate, and then there's long, very narrow stair running sideways through the site that then, landed next to a parking entrance. It wasn't necessarily the most graceful design. So kind of taking a look at that and looking at what the Realize Roslyn plan was showing, we made some sort of a counter proposal, if you will, for how we thought maybe they could use their design, but start to maybe massage it a little bit, to open it up and to get a little bit closer to what the vision was. So this was a sketch that Brett and I had worked on at the time. As you can see, sort of more direct pedestrian passages through the site, sort of wider staircases that kind of spill out onto Nash Street and also sort of open up more onto the plaza above. So what the ultimately approved plan was a little bit closer to this. So not quite what we had looked at, but again, does a better job of kind of opening that up and further reinforcing the idea of 18th Street as this pedestrian spine that's running through Roslyn. I guess another quiz. Does everybody know where this is? Show of hands. Much fewer. This is in Roslyn. This is Center Park. What? Sorry, I meant Arlington. This is Center Park at Potomac Yard. This is another example of sort of a plan that over time has started to fill in. The open space incorporates public art, a lot of interesting plantings, a lot of different spaces for different kinds of interaction. And as of right now, you can see the aerial image here is to see how sort of the initial sketches from the PDSP have started to fill in. And actually, in fact, we've got the additional buildings that are going to be coming in soon for the next 2 land bays there. So not only will the building development start to fill in a little bit more, but the open space will start to be a little bit more complete over time as well. Other things that our plans look at is things like historic preservation. And so in the Clarendon plan and through our historic preservation policies, it was envisioned to save some of these retail frontages here when this building came in Clarendon. And so, in fact, that when that got built, that was something that, because the plan called for it and our policies called for it, that was something that it was sort of looked after to make sure that happened, and it was incorporated fairly successfully into the design. This is just an example from Penrose Square on Columbia Pike. I think it's important to note that, just because we generally know what the best planning practices are and we look around at a lot of other examples, we can never really stop looking at the things that we're doing to see what the built results are and to study them and to see really what we can learn from them and how we can improve over time. So this was a study that was done by staff of Penrose Square, just kind of examining what are the different elements of the space? How do people use it at different times of day? Where are people sitting? What kind of activities are they doing? If the weather's good, the weather's bad, how does that affect how people use the space? So we kind of always like to look, even though, when things get done, we still like to go back and look at them and figure out what we can do better as we move forward. So with that, I think we'll open it up for discussion and questions.
I'd like to start this out with some of our planning commissioners. Are there questions or comments that you have about what you saw today and what you'd like to ask our staff?
Thank you for the presentation. It's very engaging and helpful. Is this on? It's on. So when you began, you gave us the widest context that you could to explain some of the fundamentals, and then you sort of drilled down. So I appreciated that. What I think you see as staff when a project comes in, an application comes in, you do start with that kind of context. But by the time we get to SPRC, that's not always quite clear. And I guess I'm thinking that it would be really quite helpful if the presentation, staff presentation of a project might give a summary of that prior thinking and even the discussions that you had with developers. Real quick, the Rittenhouse Square example stands out. So if the building that was catty-corner to the square was kind of stood out as an oddity, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I'm sure there could be arguments on both sides. It would be nice, it would be helpful, I think, for the community to understand in a case like that or other cases what that prior discussion was.
Well, let me thank you, Commissioner, for the comment. Let me just lead off. I think staff provided some really great examples, I think, that have occurred in the last 5 to 10 years, where I think we've really started to embrace and employ these principles that both Brett and Justin laid out tonight. And the case studies that both Justin and Brett discussed, the evolution of some of staff's thinking, I think, was evolving at the same time as we were going through the site plan review committee process, hearing from community members, planning commission members, other boards and commissions. So many of the images that staff presented tonight weren't developed at the preliminary submission or even before the submission was accepted and where we trigger and begin the site plan review committee efforts. So as we work with the Planning Commission, the Site Plan Review Committee, work with the applicant, work with the community, and I think it's important to note, and you started to touch on this, it has been a partnership in Arlington County between all those parties, I think, to realize some of these great plans and some of these public spaces that are now becoming to fruition. So you're right. We need to be able to communicate early and often, but I think what you've seen, and it didn't really come through, many of those plans, let's take the 18th Street concept, that evolved over a number of months as the Site Plan Review Committee process proceeded. So I think everyone benefits from that public part of the process and the roles that we all play. But again, each process, each project, as the planning commissioners know, are very different. And each have their own challenges and success stories.
Yeah, I'd like to add Samia add to that. In terms of, describe the process a little bit more about how a staff report is developed through this interaction and this partnership.
So one of the things I think is important to note is that it really is a role of staff to kind of balance the developer's proposal, what they've submitted, the SPRC and public review process, as well as internal staff and interdepartmental technical reviews as well, to kind of bring everything together. And so a lot of times, as Bob mentioned, all of these things are kind of evolving at the same time, and we're trying to balance all of those different comments, the input, and working with the developer as well to try to make sure that we're achieving the goals and objectives that's set forth in the plan. And where there are places that it does not, or there are areas where we need to continue to work to improve those, hearing from the community and then other technical experts internally, trying to make sure we can work with them and work with everyone to bring everything together. And so it really is more of an evolution at the time that the project is coming forward. So there's not always, as Bob said, we start with something and there's this open slate and the developer hasn't brought forward anything at all. A lot of times it really is, okay, this is what they've submitted, and so these are our comments on what they've submitted in terms of whether or not it's consistent, it complies with the plans, and then how do we work to achieve the goals if they're not doing that in a way that is amenable and works based on the comments that we've heard and the input that we've received at varying levels. So it's somewhat of a kind of a challenge to try to weigh and balance that all, and I think we try to take everything into account when we do that.
Another question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. First, I'd like to thank you. It's really useful to take us up, from where we're generally looking at plans. We're looking at curb cuts and parking spaces, and so it's really nice to go up 5,000 feet and kind of look at the context, because I don't know that I always do that. Of course, I'm a newer commissioner and I'm still learning. Now, having said that, you had a very interesting slide, and just out of curiosity, there was one scale of design elements that you had shown us. And what I'm wondering is there some sort of a cheat sheet that we could, because it was very useful that you had, the sizes of things and sort of how they relate and how they fit together.
Sure. In fact, our Department of Parks and Recreation has a cheat sheet, but it's mostly focused on recreational courts and playing fields, bocce courts, things of that nature, baseball diamonds. Not a lot of the amenities that you typically see in urban environments. There are some in there, but a lot of it really, involves going out in the field, visiting these places, and, with the tape measure, or, when you're traveling, just taking note or photographs and referring back to those. We think about, like, Bryant Park in New York, we always think about. I feel like everybody uses it as an example when they show us a public space. But there's so many different activities within that park. Some of them are pop-up, some of them are permanent. And yes, there are some dimensions out there on the internet that you can get to. We don't have a cheat sheet for all of those, but like I said, our Parks and Recreation Department has some more recreational style dimensions that we could share with you.
And I'd like to follow up with Justin a little bit about one of the first slides you showed was about enclosure. Why is that so important? And what are some examples, I guess, where the failure to create that sense of enclosure is really a challenge to creating that sense of place?
Again, I think it's about being social. And so if you have, if you have a series of buildings that are enclosing a space within fairly close proximity, it's, there's eyes on that space, and you sort of feel it's sort of an engaging space, as opposed to, if you're just in a very wide street or in a big open parking lot where you can't necessarily see the faces of other buildings, or I guess it's, in a way, it's almost like, some people make the analogy that buildings are like people. And I think if you think of it that way, is it comfortable to stand in the middle of a room and everyone is like way in the distance, but they're like looking at you from far away? Or would you rather be, within close proximity to other people where you can actually see their face and have a conversation with them? And so I think in that respect, I think that's sort of, at the heart of that sense of enclosure. It's really about being social.
So I'm Jim Harris. I attend a lot of county board meetings, a lot of planning commission meetings, and even ZOCO, other meetings. I am resident of Arlington, where I've lived for 25 years, and before that, the Ballston corridor, which is undergoing massive redevelopment near Glebe Road. I completely oppose any more new urbanism, which I and others believe is development for the sake of development, infill for the sake of infill, growth for the sake of growth, trying to pack as many people, activities, events, and vehicles into as little space as possible. If you want to know where that's taking place right now, the so-called car-free diet, look at the intersection of Wilson and Glebe, look at the intersection of Washington and Glebe, look at the intersection of Fairfax and Glebe. Thousands and thousands of vehicles packed into as little space as possible in a so-called car-free diet. So what I see you doing, I see you as total adherence to new urbanism, smart growth. No one who is not an adherent to new urbanism, smart growth, can be appointed to the Planning Commission, can be on county staff, or even elected to the county board after 25 years. Okay? What I am asking for is two things. Moratorium on new urbanism until alternatives can be at least discussed. And I want to see some alternatives presented besides these meetings in the county board offices or the county manager's offices with the likes of JBG and Vornado, and get these infill projects that cram as many people and vehicles into as little space as possible. 1555 Wilson Boulevard, Wilson School is a prime example. Do you have a question? My question is, how long is this total adherence to new urbanism to the detriment of the county's residents going to go on? To Mr.
I think it's been going on for several thousand years. So, Bob, you want to answer that?
Well, Jim, thank you. And I know you have a very clear and strong opinion, and that's important that we all have those opinions. One thing you mentioned was time. And in the presentation that staff made tonight, while we talk about physical elements of urban form and urban design and how they sometimes evolve and what today certainly makes great places, how they all work together, the one, I think, theme throughout all of that, though, is time. And if you look back, we showed images of how Savannah began and how the early plan laid out a basic sort of infrastructure, if you will, of public spaces and streets. Common themes throughout really sound American planning, I think, in many ways. And I think that issue of time is so important to understand for Arlington. You know, we're a fairly young urban place in many ways. And we've gone through some phases. And there are a number of Crystal City residents here that were really at the earliest phase when the Blue Line and Metro Line was first constructed. And there are a lot of things I think we've learned through that early sort of urban renewal and redevelopment phase that was tied to the first wave of Metro investment. And again, without Metro, we wouldn't be here tonight probably or talking about great urban design and urban planning for many reasons. So there was this early phase, I think, that Arlington went through. Then I think in the early 90s, late 90s, many of the principles that staff began to discuss tonight really became into play. And so you saw tonight some examples of the last 10 years or so where we've added great spaces. We're going to see a new public space in Roslyn in Central Place. You saw the Penn Place Center Park. Roslyn Plaza has some major new public spaces in its long-term plan. So we're still in an early phase, I think, of placemaking at many of our metros. Jim, if you get your chance. We're at a very early stage of I think, creating a great urban environment here. But again, I think as some of the plans pointed out, we've really laid the groundwork through our successful planning. And that planning has been recognized nationally and internationally, and it is a success story that Arlington needs to be proud of, and it is proud of. But over time, we'll continue, I think, to further advance, further evolve, and even create greater public spaces, as you've seen tonight by many of these great examples.
Another question?
Thanks. Yeah, Jason, you had a nice slide example of the public space analysis. I think it's a terrific idea. And you said Penrose Square. I was just curious, is that an ongoing program, or do we have a work plan for doing this and picking out some other places? Because I can see some, not only the more recent ones we've done, but just even going back more than 10 or 15 years to see what those good choices or mistakes were.
Yeah, there was a couple other spaces that we looked at. Water Park was one of them. And I'm trying to, can you help remind me what the other ones were? It's not necessarily an ongoing, it's, you know, when there is some time to sort of work on that kind of stuff, we sort of go out and like look at stuff and examine it. But no, it's not necessarily an ongoing program. But we did look at a couple other spaces.
We looked at Shirlington on Campbell Avenue.
Yeah, that's
We looked at Gateway Park in Roslyn. Welburn Square in Ballston. Yep. Those.
That's post-occupancy evaluation is the technical term. And I think it's really important because as we look at these new site plans, we look at what are the lessons learned. Where are men sitting? Where are women sitting? Where at different times of year? You start to observe human behavior because these public spaces are really for the benefit of the people. It's building that place for people to gather, to rest. If you look at Courthouse today, people just go back and forth through the parking lot. There's no conversations, there's no pausing. So we're really looking at trying to create those kind of places where people collide and have the interaction, and that's the foundation of community. And that's why we look at these spaces and trying to learn lessons from those, and I think it's been successful.
Thank you. It's very interesting overall. I was particularly interested in the evolution of the open space at the Blue Goose, one of my favorite buildings, no longer there. But I like the memorialization of it. And part of that is because it seems to me that virtually all of the spaces that we deal with as open space are privately owned. And that's particularly painful for those of us who live in Crystal City, where the county owns 2 median strips, one of which is going to go away soon, and that's it. So everything, we are at the mercy of developers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that anywhere where there's a plan that calls for open space and is conceptual, that's not good enough. And developers who come in with open space that may adhere to the letter of the concept plan, but completely lack creativity or any of the elements of the urban design, open space enclosure, outdoor room, eyes on the street concept is lacking. And so I think more than, as Jane referred to, some of the basic concepts coming in, I think it's really important that a staff report maybe address that up front and just say, there are, maybe it's just a few bullet points of basic guidelines so that those of us who are looking at a development submission can say, okay, technically it has the square footage required or suggested by a plan and in the right space, a location. But in no other way does it really fulfill some of the concepts that you're talking about and that we'd like to see. And since it's not county-owned and county-controlled, it's even more important that these guidelines be adhered to, and that in order, particularly because there has never been a development that I've spent 35 years looking at that has ever come through as is without some sort of concession required. And I think that the way we deal with open space and other community amenities ought to be tied to making sure that it's a genuine bonus for the community, and that includes how it looks and how we can use it day in and day out.
Well, Judy, thanks for the question. And, well, a little bit of a statement, but I think the point is well taken. And I think what we need to continue to do as a community is ensure that our professional staff, our planning commission, our civic associations and residents, and most importantly, the developer, have the kind of working knowledge and understanding of what these principles that we've talked about tonight. So I think we've learned a number of good lessons, I think, and I think we're trying to deploy as much as staff has discussed tonight. And I think we have some success stories in the last number of years. I think you saw some of them tonight. I think some of them deal with the phase development site plans, whether it's Pentagon City, Roslyn Plaza, or several other examples where we've been able to think about multiple buildings, phase development, and how public spaces, the street network, and those elements come together, will come together over time. And I think it will continue to take time for many of these objectives to be realized. But you're so right. We have to be committed and vigilant and be focused on all the points that you've raised, and we're committed certainly to do that.
Yeah, I think too that's why this urban design and research section was created, because we have the talent. These guys, we've all worked in the private sector. We've worked for those developers. We understand how they think. We also have a very high bar, and I think one of the things that we are striving for is to build a relationship and give you, the community, the tools, because you serve as our allies in this conversation. If we can help you express the terms that we've been talking about and have those expectations, you become the advocate. It's as Samia talked about, we have an important role to balance everything. But I think the role of the community is to really explicitly describe their expectations. So it's not back to, I don't like this, or I wish it was something else. It's starting to use this terminology. And I think that's the language that the developers understand. And I think that's part of what we're here to do, is to not only express that, but also engage the community and help you understand and do a better job, if you will, to advocate for the visions that the community created. And that's, I think, the beauty of the process that we have. While it's laborious, as they say, Rome was not built in a day, DC was not built in a decade. And I think that the county has done a fabulous job of establishing the vision. It's the implementation is where the road gets a little rocky. But I think the examples you saw where we've applied it and really steadily worked through that process, we've had some great success. Got another question over here.
thanks very much for the presentation. Question I had is, it seems like a lot of this was sort of learning from the past and looking at historical examples. I'd be interested to hear, a multidisciplinary view of and an opinion of the future trajectory and innovations that you think that you'll see in open spaces in the next 10 to 20 years.
Well, let me kick it off from the planning perspective. I talked about time and the phases that Arlington has gone through. It's fairly recent, less than 50 years. From more of an urban renewal phase where it's still car-centric, even with metro on the horizon. And we evolved in the 80s and 90s to begin to embrace some of these principles. And now one of the fundamental areas that we focus on are what you saw tonight. And we saw some recent examples, again, the last 5 or 10 years, Columbia Pike, Roslyn, and so on, where I think we're retrofitting and pressing back on some of these plans. And so we're now entering a phase in Arlington. Let's just take the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, for example. You saw the slide that Samia Bird had, which showed our 5 metro station planning areas. And you saw most of them are filled up by these tan areas, which are the site plans. Almost every block, urban block, is covered by a site plan. We have over 450 of those site plans, a large percentage of them in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. Many of them date back, Samia, to the late 70s, 80s, I think.
Some go back to like the 60s.
So what we're going to see next in a new wave, I think, is refurbishment, adaptive reuse, redesign, and redevelopment. And in preparing for that next generation of transit-oriented development and placemaking in Arlington, we're going to have to think about what changes might take place to some of those existing public spaces. We have a Park and Rec Commission here tonight who really did an outstanding job recently to sort of do a survey of what those spaces are today, what conditions they are, and so on. And so based on some work, we've talked to both Park and Rec and our Planning Commission about a project that we hope will start this year in our work program, and that is to develop a really detailed inventory of all those privately owned spaces that have public easements that some probably think they're public parks, but they're really privately owned. We're going to inventory, recognize what conditions govern those, and then, based on some principles you saw tonight, develop some urban design principles and guidelines to help our Planning Commission, Park and Rec, to begin to think about, as those spaces change, how we can work again, either as a county or with the private sector, to evolve those, adapt those, to make them even better, make them into a network, and ensure that they provide a number of these principles that Justin and Brett talked about tonight. So we're going to go through that phase, I think, of change and growth, and we're gearing up to apply many of these principles that you see here today.
And Brett, why don't you talk a little bit about what we're doing in the interim in terms of trying to activate these spaces in a more immediate fashion?
Yeah, I was going to mention one trend that's happening now, and it's extremely popular, is just testing out ideas with temporary pop-up improvements. Some of the examples we showed tonight in New York, where they've reclaimed street space and turned it into pedestrian plaza space with just some temporary materials, low cost, relatively easy to install. They test it, and then if it works and folks get used to it, then they invest in it in their capital program and turn it into a permanent plaza. But testing ideas, we did that outside here at Courthouse with a pop-up plaza on 15th Street right at the entrance to the parking lot here, if you haven't seen it. Again, we don't know how long it's going to be before we have a courthouse square, but in the meantime, we wanted to reclaim an unsafe area for handicap parking and relocate that to a safer location, and we've turned it into a pedestrian plaza. We've coordinated with an artist to create a ground mural, and there's landscaping and movable furniture out there, and it's been successful so far. We did it in 8 hours with paint and some potted plants and some furniture. It's relatively cheap and easy to install, and it's been a huge success. But I mean, again, that whole pop-up nature of things, testing ideas before we start investing a lot of funding into public spaces is a trend at the moment.
And I think another thing that we will begin to see, while we have some more recently adopted sector plans in areas, for example, Crystal City and Roslyn, where those were some of our older first site plans that were approved in the 60s and 70s, and they're starting to reach the end of their useful life, but not quite ready to redevelop under those newer plans. And so it'll take some time to realize some of the plans and the goals that we've set forward. We'll see a lot of projects come in for some of the interim types of uses, or some things that they can do with the existing buildings that Bob mentioned, like adaptive reuse. So for example, we had the We Work, We Live project in Crystal City, and trying to understand, are there some interim uses for some of these projects or these sites that would be appropriate until such time as they are ready for the full-scale redevelopment, or that full-scale redevelopment is incentivized to the point that we would actually start to see then those plans being implemented. Because as we can tell now, you know, plans are set, the visions are established, but it does take quite a bit of time for them to be realized through the private development process. And so I think the trend now is, what are some appropriate ways to look at interim uses for those sites until such time as the new development or redevelopment comes forward?
You know, this element of time, again, just came up in what Brett and Samia discussed. Another good example of an interim sort of tactical urbanism, as planners and urban designers like to call it sometimes, is over the property, the triangle on Wilson, that the Korean embassy provided the county with the opportunity to transform a fairly unused parking lot into today what's a very cost-effective multi-use sort of park. People play bocce, people have lunch, there's seating, working again with the county's real estate office, working with the embassy, working with Park and Recreation and our urban design and planning staff. You know, we're able to do things like that. And again, over time, we need to try to apply these principles in the most cost-effective way, but recognize they start to prime the pump and get us moving in the right direction. So the more that we can do, I think it'll be extremely valuable for the county.
One comment and then a short question. The comment is that oftentimes in meetings I've been to, terms active and passive have been used in reference to different kinds of open spaces. And you know, that may have been in the textbooks for 50 years, but I think it sort of creates a problem as much as it frames one, and that is because passive implies that it does nothing, and therefore it's less valued, and therefore open spaces that are not structured can't compete against all of the various interests in an urban area. And yet we know now, of course, that, and I'm sure through the later decades, you know, it's being taught that unstructured spaces are at least as important. Perhaps more important, because all of hardscape is structured. So if you've got anything that's got a blade of green, that's really critical. So it would seem to me that just as a matter of sort of common parlance, you know, that ought to get out of that terminology ought to be deposed, and I don't know whether it's programmed and unprogrammed or structured, unstructured, whatever. I can't say the answer to that, but I think that especially when you get away from those who are design professionals who understand all the nuances, you get to the general public. Passive means, hey, up for grabs, whatever, you know, choose your thing. So that to me, that's a problem, because it creates conflicts and creates problems rather than solving them. So my question is, and it's kind of related to this, obviously, is how do biophilic design principles fit into the various hierarchies in the Arlington design process? Because that, I think, those kinds of principles, which can be applied at a number of different levels, can help educate as well as resolve and guide. So Is that on the radar? Is that kind of stuff on the radar now?
It certainly is. Great observation and really good question and a timely one. You know, when we talk about passive versus active, I think the county's now working on really an important planning effort that our Park and Recreation Department is leading, and many of the staff up here tonight are participating, and that's our new Public Open Spaces Master Plan. And I think you'll see as the staff is now beginning to bring that out to the community and talk more about it as part of the process, you're going to see they're trying to address some of those very issues. How do we deal with these more urban spaces and other spaces I'd call urban natural areas, like 4 Mile Run, where the county and the city of Alexandria have been working together for years, and now you're seeing the actual rehabilitation, rejuvenation of that important waterway. We've also just begun an important planning process, very small area, but no less important, on 4 Mile Run, just north of that, where we have the last industrial and service district in the county, where Jenny Dean Park is there. We have Shirlington, other new neighborhoods, the Nauk community, which is committed to, been committed to many years to revitalization. And there we're trying to balance those issues you've raised between what I'll call an urban natural area and 4 Mile Run with hard edges, a mix of different uses, connectivity through pedestrian and other ways. So I think it's your question, again, is very timely, and I think it's an important area we're working on now, but I think the county's long-range plan that's coming forward is going to give us more direction in that area.
Hi. Bob, I think that you're right, the panelists are right, that the Roslyn-Ballston corridor is, those buildings from the 60s through the 80s are ripe for being redone. That should be an opportunity for us. We have some streets that are still really pretty bad. For example, Quincy Street in Ballston between Fairfax and Wilson. Big towers on all sides except for the Szechuan Walk. You have these big towers. You have a very windswept, empty sidewalk area. The street proportions seem to be off for the traffic that goes on it compared to the sidewalks, and then the height of the buildings around it. It doesn't really work very well at all. It's not very open and welcoming, even though it's very dense and urban. We also are in our toolbox now for animating streets, of course, is retail in many ways. Ballston, of course, is very dense. Retail seems to make sense. But we're going through a nationwide change in that retail space is going to be shrinking. We're overstored. And I know we have alternative, what we consider alternative retail uses, but I'm not sure even that's going to be enough. We're going to have to be looking at getting these streets better designed after the first generation showed it didn't work, but we don't have the same tools to keep them animated that we've used in the past. So when we have a street like Quincy, when it does come up for time for being redone, we have to find ways, and it's a question more of an observation and a challenge. What are we going to do, planning commission, planning staff, to help get that animated if we can't use retail the way we have in the past as a magnet for animating a street?
Justin, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Well, I think it's a really good point. And I think in a lot of ways, sometimes we have looked to retail as being the only solution for activating streets. And I think it can be done with other uses as well. I mean, a residential street can be incredibly active as well. I think a lot has to do with the design of the building specifically. I mean, if the buildings are designed in such a way that they're meant to engage with the street, that they either have, if they're larger buildings and they have balconies or porches that are facing onto the street, or small dooryards for townhouses, things like that. And as I mentioned, frequent entrances to units as opposed to just having one entrance to a building, maybe that is the only entrance on the block that doesn't really do a lot to help to activate it. So I certainly think that there are other uses. Every use, building use, I think, is perfectly capable of helping to make the street social and active. I think there's just slightly different strategies you have to use depending on the building type.
Justin, I have a follow-up question. You were working in the private sector and helped us develop the Columbia Pike Corridor and the form-based code. And more recently, you just did a session a couple weeks ago looking at the buildings. What trends are you seeing in the architectural profession today that might sort of lead us to, reinforcing some of these urban design fundamentals that we're striving for?
Well, I think, in general, I feel like design professionals are being more cognizant of buildings that are engaging with the street. I think that by nature, buildings are much less suburban than they used to be. Like I'd mentioned, just frequent doors and windows and things like that are now part of, I think, the common vocabulary of architects and designers as they're coming up with concepts for sites, whereas in the past that wasn't necessarily the case. I think previously sometimes the overall design concept as, the building as a sculpture sometimes often trumped the responsibility of the building to be a good neighbor. So I think in that sense, buildings, whether, you like the designs or not, specifically of the materials and things like that, I think generally the trend is that the buildings are being more social.
Great point. Question back here.
Thank you. Bob, I appreciate you talking about time. Some of us in this room have been around in this business long enough to recognize the importance of time. I'm not sure how good the county's doing with it, though. It seems, I've noted on many occasions, we're tearing down things that were built maybe close to that 25-year limit. That's considered antique for cars, but not for historic purposes here. We've had some losses, and I'm not talking about buildings. I'm not talking about things that, why did that go away? Why are we losing a bridge in Ballston? Why did we lose one in Crystal City? Both which were iconic and good, strong references. Why do we do light pole programs that get about 70% there? We switch to the new scheme and have to, as if the whole thing is going to be done over again. I'd like to see, I'd like to see the lamp poles, whether they're made out of fiberglass or aluminum, dated so that we have some appreciation for because time is a dimension that's just not a part of our thinking, I think, when we do it here. An interesting thing is that Bryant Park is about time. It's about the creation of public spaces that are flexible enough to be popped up all over the place to adapt to time changes in time uses. We actually the original plan for Wellborn Square was a miniature Bryant Park, and some people thought that it just wasn't modern enough or fixed enough, or it was maybe too plain, and yet I think we would have been better served with that. Another part of time is for us to look at at sites in terms of what's working here. I mean, and does this, what can we save, or what's, do we really need to change this? And Gateway Park is a good, Gateway Park in Roslyn is a very good example of that. There just are elements there that work wonderfully, but nobody goes and sees them work on at movie night or whatever it is. And what you're talking about in terms of a creative adaptation and the economies and things of the time, it's good. I mean, that's going to bring out and empowering people to go do stuff. We've been talking about this for a long time. We keep running into roadblocks for empowerment of people. But all of these are functions, actually functions of time. And I think we should think in terms of appreciating that sense and building in opportunities for time to enrich spaces.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question here.
Thank you. I very much appreciated the slides, Justin and Brett, that you were showing concerning some things that were built, for instance, the study about Penrose Square. And I'm wondering, for you two and for Samia as well, thinking somewhat about some of our conditions and things, if you all sometimes take time to go out and walk around in Arlington and figure out and take the snapshots of what's worked and what hasn't worked, which I think you're thinking about it to help us as planning commissioners and commissioners of other commissions, I hate using that word 3 times, and our residents, when we come to around the SPRC table and we see an applicant come in, and for instance, they want to put residential units right on the street, and we know how that doesn't work in Clarendon, but we think it might work at Red Top at the different designs. And so, I look to you guys to sort of tell us, or either at that table or offline with the developer, look, this worked, this didn't, drop that. And so I'm wondering, have you guys, I don't want you to give up any secrets, but do you have your little cache of sort of do's and don'ts and things you're thinking about the next time you see this proposal, what you would recommend? Justin, do you want to start?
Sure. For me, there's, after a site plan gets built, I go out and inspect the facades to be sure that everything is built according to the way that they were approved by the county board. And when I do that, I usually look, not only am I sort of checking the built results against what was approved, but I'm also kind of looking at all the details, and I'm kind of seeing how new materials that the architects and designers are using actually look in practice. And I'm looking at how all the pieces go together. And I'm sort of making like I always kind of keep a mental note of like, oh, wow, that didn't really work out so well in this building. So the next time somebody comes in with that, I know that I can go to this building and take a picture and show them and say, well, see, you're saying that it's going to look good, but I actually have a picture here of a building that was built just last year, and it actually doesn't look so hot. So yeah, there's certainly things like that I kind of keep a little mental tally of some of those different materials and configurations and things that I know that when they come up again in the future that I need to say something to, maybe try to persuade the developer to go in a different direction.
Brett, why don't you talk a little bit about how you look at these spaces post-approval?
Yeah, the same holds true with the landscape and some of these hardscape plaza spaces. The one difference with landscapes is that they're living and they evolve, and what a lot of people say is that you never really get to appreciate a landscape until it's been in the ground for 10 years. Because when things are first planted, everything's young and small, it doesn't have time to mature, it all falls back on maintenance, and so these are all things that we look at when we're looking at plans, but also when we do inspections and post-occupancy evaluations like you saw earlier. But yeah, it's really looking at what's working, what's not, thinking about, for one example I think of is tree pits and people that walk their dogs, and then all the ground cover and lush plantings in the tree pits end up dying. There's a solution to that, and that's putting a tree fence around the tree pit. It's a little bit more cost, but it does keep pedestrians and dog owners from using that space. It also helps with the health of the tree. It reduces compaction of the soil. So there's little things like that that you can learn just by witnessing spaces and, looking at what's working and what's not. So,
Samia, you want to add to that and talk a little bit about what the current planning team does in terms of understanding the context and so forth?
I can speak first to the question that Nancy raised about things that, maybe you see from projects you've worked on that you are kind of carrying forward when you work on the next project. I can think of maybe an example or two or more of a couple of projects that I worked on, and then when I see it built and I'm like, why did we do that? That wasn't such a good idea. Or maybe we conditioned something to address a site-specific situation that worked for one site, and then maybe we kind of try to apply that to another site that comes in with a similar concept and it doesn't work out so well for them. One of the things things that, or maybe we improve upon it. So one of the things that I can think about is when we worked on the ZOM project, which is, it was the old Hollywood Boulevard site, it's now built out in 1900, Clarendon project, and they wanted to provide these units on, they weren't going to provide actually any units on the Clarendon side, and they were thinking about doing kind of a live-work thing, and we had some bad experiences with live-work units at other developments that didn't quite work out well. And so what we did was we improved upon, I think, the condition to make those units not live-work, but the option to be either retail or commercial, and they could kind of flip back and forth, and we were able to craft some language that actually worked for them to be able to do that, so that it wasn't necessarily restrictive like the condition we had applied for a live-work unit that didn't really work out so well for another project. Or to Justin's point, the balconies there, which were a big deal and a big point of discussion during SPRC process, and we kind of worked with them on that. And now when I look at them sometimes, that's kind of, for me personally, that's the one thing about the building that I don't like. Like, I like everything else about the building, and it turned out great, but then when I look at those balconies, and I remember the discussions we had, I was like, yeah, it's kind of not my favorite part of the building either. So there are those instances, I think, that we all have, and those experiences we all have after something actually gets built, or when we've worked on conditions and we've gone back and forth with a developer, and we've heard what the community said, and then staff as well is trying to craft things, and then when you get to a place where something that they want to change or they want to do that actually would be consistent in the spirit and intent of things, but we've bound it so much by what we've written, or we didn't write it the right way to really do what we thought it was going to do. So then you do carry those experiences forward with you to try to make a difference for the next project, so that it doesn't turn out that way, or you can improve upon it. So I think we continue to evolve and grow with each project we do, and we always take those experiences with us each project, and we do try to inform on them when we work with the developer, and also through the SPRC process to bring those things out or to fruition. So I don't know if that got to what you wanted me to also speak to.
And I think to this gentleman's comment about the passive space, if you look at something like Colonial Place across the street, they probably said this will be great passive space. It's certainly passive, it's dead, right? But then you look at the passive space in Colonial Village right next door, and it's alive, it's a great place to be. So I think you're on to something in the sense that we cannot just sort of allow these terms to sort of take over and be an excuse. We really need to apply the fundamentals that we're talking about, because if we've been able to apply those at Colonial Place, we would have seen right away that these little triangular shaped patches of green are not really going to be active, because they don't have that sense of enclosure. They don't have the quality of materials that we're talking about. And we're only getting better at this, I think. And I think as Tom alluded to, or as Bob alluded to, it takes time. And we're a young community, and I think we're building the expertise, but we also need you as citizen planners to build that expertise. And so I have a question for both Brett and Justin and Samia. As citizen planners, what can you tell them about how you look at space, or how you experience space, or how have you educated yourselves to become who you are in terms of your profession? And how can they do the same?
I mean, I think for me personally, it is looking at historic places, because I feel like, you can actually see for yourself how these places function, and you sort of get ideas from them. And I think it's, I do feel like, for citizen planners, that's probably a good strategy. Go see as many different kinds of public spaces as you can, new ones, old ones, different types of buildings, how the buildings interact with those public spaces and the streets. And I think it gives you an idea of not only what works and what doesn't work, but it gives you an idea of what maybe your personal preferences for things are as well. So, I mean, I think it's, for a designer to say, oh, I don't really need to go look at other stuff, I can just come up with stuff on my own. I think it's, I don't think that's necessarily the right attitude to have about it. I think everyone, your ideas constantly build on other people's ideas. So you kind of need that history and those examples really to to understand the implications of what it is that you're doing.
Brett, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess for me, and I think you touched on it earlier, Chris, is, I mean, we're really creating these places for people and social spaces, and, you know, what works for you may not work for you, and, you know, having variety and options in our public spaces is important, you know, and that our spaces are all inclusive for all ages, children, and our elderly folks as well, but, you know, and everybody in between, all ages. And so these are all things we have to consider when looking at design. And it really comes down to how people feel in the space. And how I feel may not be the way you feel. But that there's variety and options, and it's not just one thing or the other. You know,
I think it sort of brings up the notion of empathy. Because as an urban designer, we need to think, what is this space what's it experience from a 5-year-old's perspective? What's the experience from an 85-year-old person's perspective? So as urban designers, we try and empathize with the users, whether it's someone who's pushing a stroller, so that we make sure that median is wide enough for someone with a stroller to stand there as they wait for the signal to turn. We think about the active person who's using it for jogging and bicycling. But we also look at it for somebody who just wants to read a book. And so as urban designers, I think it's really important that we put ourselves in your shoes and look at the wide spectrum of how people experience places. And I think that helps inform. So my recommendation is next time you're out, think like a 5-year-old. Think about how this kid would experience this. What would they be threatened by? What would they feel safe about? And you talked about the cafe and the relationship to the children's play area at Penn Place. That's so I can sit there and have a cup of coffee. I can also keep an eye on my kids. So those relationships are very important, but they're not accidental. And I think that's part of what we do.
And I think my perspective as a doing development review as a planner is certainly different from the expertise of an architect and a landscape architect who are designers by trade. And I think one of the things that is unique about the site plan role is that we sort of serve as the intermediary, the broker, the person that looks at the policy, the person that looks at the rules and the regulations, and then works with all of the expert staff, the community, and everyone to see, okay, now how can we balance all of this out to make sure that we're achieving everything that we set out to do? So it's a lot different in that way, and so we're looking at everything, I think, at a higher level, more comprehensively, and then relying on other staff and community members and different departments to kind of help us to bring everything together to a place where we feel like, okay, this is a proposal that is acceptable by a private developer that will achieve our vision and our goal to the greatest extent possible, with some balances, some checks and balances here and there. And then when you actually see the projects built and you actually get to go out and experience them, then you understand the function and the form and the relationship and how everything came together and the significance of that in terms of shaping a place overall. And so I think that's a little bit of a unique experience that I have related to everything else, of how it all comes together.
Just building on what staff has talked about, I think one thing that's very important, and as you've heard from the presentation tonight, the level of collaboration, whether it's current planning, urban design, our great comprehensive planning staff, we work together as a team with the Department of Environmental Services, Real Estate, Parks and Rec. That's one thing that I think makes Arlington planning outstanding, and why we achieve some great results, and we'll continue to do that. Just two things. Another plug-in for the county's public spaces master plan, which is now coming forward for community review. I encourage everyone here tonight and everyone else in Arlington to get involved. Look at that plan. Look at its principles. Understand its goals and the strategies that are laid out. It's a very proactive and very strategic-based planning effort, and that's what we need in Arlington County now. So this is a time to really share some of the thoughts we've heard tonight, some of the ideas into that plan, because we have a number of elements of our comprehensive plan. Our general land use plan, which sets the stage in terms of use. Our master transportation plan, which deals with the network. But what binds it together are those public spaces. And it's more than just parks, open spaces, or plazas. It's really this network. And for some homework, you might want to take a look at what I think a great urban planner who's now Mayor de Blasio's park commissioner in New York, Mitchell Silver, is doing with the 5 boroughs and the plan and planning and park improvements there, is thinking about parks without borders. And that's really true. It is a system, if you will. And you saw some of that tonight in the presentations that Brad and Justin and Samia made. We need to think about these spaces not as individuals, but as the fabric that knits together the uses, the various features, and the networks. And we have a chance to do that with our new Park and Recreation Master Plan, and it's a new opportunity.